All right, everybody, welcome back to Coffee with Coaches. This is Coach Reese. We're here with Coach Loretta and Coach Stephanie Dannenberg. So we have three coaches on for y'all today. Stephanie is somebody who I've seen at races and who I've had conversations with in the past, but we don't get to talk all that much or in depth. So I'm pretty excited to get to know more about you and about your specialties and how you coach your athletes. So I'm excited to chat with you today. But how are you two doing?
I'm doing great. Still working out my niggles and slowly easing myself back into running and getting some hope.
Oh, fantastic. How about you, Coach Stephanie?
I am starting on a lot of base training. So
Nice.
I have been doing Ironman this year as opposed to more trail running. And now I'm switching back to more of the ultra scene and the trail running for this year. And I've learned a lot and I'm just glad to get back into the base training phase again.
Oh, fantastic. Cool. I'm a little injured right now. I have a little foot thing going on, so I decided to take some time off from running. So if you guys follow me on Strava, I've been doing some ridiculous indoor spinning workouts. Just got back from one with the ladies at 6 a.m. spin class at the local gym near me. They're a hoot. They're fun. But I can't wait to get back to the trails. But hopefully you give it some time off, right? Like let this time of the year be the dictator on if you're going to be running, taking some time off, working on your injuries, maybe increasing strength, come back 2024 like even stronger than ever. So that's where I'm at. But Coach Stephanie, so tell us a little bit about your background. Like I hear something about being a collegiate athlete. How was the trajectory from kind of like your youth with sports and running through college and now on beyond?
So I blame my ADHD, which, people see as negative, but I see it as positive, right? So ever since I was little, like 5 years old, I've been in like team sports and just, need to get energy out. And that really didn't subside when I got into, high school and to college and I joined tennis and soccer teams at my school. And I did that, 8-season athlete there. And everything's like super structured. It's given to you like the coaching and everything, and that's all good and well. And when I got out on my own, grad school came along and I still kind of played like club soccer, club sports and things like that. But I'd run like occasionally. It's like, what? Well, what do? You run for fitness. I didn't have any direction. I didn't have any coaching or anything like that, you know. And then afterwards, I decided to do a 5K because I was like, it doesn't seem very far. Um, and I actually ended up walking to the 5K because it was like really close, but it was more like 1.5 miles. I probably ended up doing like 6 miles that day. Um, and I was like, wow, this is really hard. You have to like run the whole time. And, my expectations of like what a race was just really skewed. Like I grew up, in Southwest Virginia, like in the Appalachians, the Blue Ridge Mountains. And, we went hiking all the time. It was something that you could do. It's free. It's open all year round. And so, I was always like out in the woods. I grew up in like the country. So we had like a lot of land and I would just go out into the woods, you just go out and you have fun as like a kid. So I had all of this background. And then I came into this trail 5K that I just signed up for after all of this. And there was a lady there reminds me of Loretta. And she was standing like at the forefront, ready to go. And I was too. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna run hard. She's like, you do realize this is a trail race? I was like, "Ugh." I didn't really like process it. You just kind of run, So I didn't exactly know what that meant. And so I just did it. I didn't see anything different, even at, doing the race. I was like, you just, you run through the woods. That's what you do. It's just faster hiking. And so that's, what led me. And I still went through this confusion into my late 20s. And I was training for my first marathon. And I did a lot of the road running. I did a lot of the course. I lived near it and it was in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I knew that you should probably practice on the course. That makes a lot of sense. So I would go up and down this mountain, just trying to gain the endurance to be able to do it. And what I didn't realize is that it is a really good thing to do. Um, And I still kind of went through this whole process. I went through my second marathon. My second marathon was very flat. It was in the Outer Banks. And I was like, this is really hard. You have to like run. You have to like keep running. There's nothing to slow you down. And I just didn't really understand what was going on, that you could run the whole time. And, you weren't stuck at like a power hike speed or something like that, or walk running the mountain. And so I was extremely sore because I didn't have anywhere flat to train. And I just didn't use the muscles that much. And I was like, okay, well, I'm going to go back to the first marathon I did. And the second time, I'm going to do it better. I'm going to do it better this time. And so I signed up for my first 50K, not knowing what an ultra was. And it was on the trails, and it had this thing called the death climb, which was 1,500 feet in a mile. And I just, I just did not get it. And I went up this hill. It was not a trail. It was just like little streamers going straight up the side of this mountain. I was like, well, that's how it is. And then I started doing more trail races and I started like this comprehension started, flowing over me. It's like, wait, this is very different. Like different places have different aspects of running. You've got to figure this out. Like, and all this time I was just running and enjoying things. I was like, wait, you can do this better. You can kind of fine tune your skills. And now I started to realize that, okay. And then I started looking up training plans and figuring things out. So that's kind of the basics of it. So my heart and my home is in the mountains. That's the big gist of it.
That's a fun story.
Beautiful. There was a lot there. Great. Okay, so let's talk about like currently. I see Hellbender on the horizon. That's coming up in May 2024. It looks like you just got done with a 25 miler, Beast of the East in North Carolina. Wow, it looks like you've been all over the place, and you've got results like going back years. So you have a lot of experience with this. So let's say you're a new athlete, you've never run in a mountain race. Let's take you as an example. An athlete comes to you and says, I want to run Hellbender 100. Like, what are you thinking about for them? Like, let's say they come from, a lot of us here in Flatland, Illinois. So maybe this athlete wants to run Hellbender, wants to run a 100-miler, maybe has a couple ultra finishes in their belt. What are they thinking of? What kind of questions are you asking? How are you guiding this athlete into the race of their dreams?
So the first thing that I would probably ask is like, how is your regular training? How do you structure your normal training? That kind of dictates how you're going to handle someone kind of moving forward. If someone's like more time-based or mileage-based, and then you've got to reformat the way they think about it. So when you're doing things like mountain training, you've got to kind of switch gears to, from your typical kind of run week where you do maybe like a speed work or a hill work. And, you want to incorporate those things, but you kind of want to focus more specifically on what the course is going to do. So, and it's a little bit harder coming from the flatlands because you don't have those hills that are very long. We have very steep hills. No doubt about it. Anyone who's run like Kettle and gone up to like there's a little stony part, and it's like, oh, that's kind of hard on like the back end of the course. But what I would say is that, okay, we're going to take your mileage and we're going to kind of like throw it out the window for now. And we've got to kind of start at the beginning. And kind of create these mini goals. So one of them that I like to start out with is having, someone aim for like an 18 or 20-minute mile going uphill, like on technical terrain, if they have the ability to go outside. Just kind of find one of their local hills and just kind of see how that goes, how to test it out, how do they feel? And then we can go from there. Kind of like towards the latter end of training, you might want to suggest like having a goal elevation gain per week. You know how you have like volume with miles per week, you kind of want to switch that to like, how much climbing can I get in a week? And, mileage does come with that. And unfortunately, there's more mileage that you get here in the Midwest than you would somewhere like Colorado or like on the East Coast, where you can get, gain very quickly in a very short amount of time. So kind of like starting there and, yes, building up kind of like the resistance, and especially emphasizing that it's not about climbing. It's not all about climbing. It's also about descending. right? Because like if when you get tired, your quads get weaker. Like you use your quads even when you're, you know, running straight. But then when you come downhill, you have that like that impact eccentric load. So you want to make sure that people are kind of prepared for that. So then you start incorporating like, are you okay with doing some strength training to kind of like complement your, you know, your running schedule?
That is fantastic. There is so much there, and I want to kind of like pick apart like all those individual little things. I just want to start off by saying like playing devil's advocate. Like, wait, what? You're telling me I'm going to go from 60 miles a week with 2,000 foot of elevation gain to 40 miles a week with 8,000 foot of elevation gain? We're going to ramp up that elevation, but my mileage is going to come down. Isn't that going to make me slower? Isn't that going to, I'm not going to hit my mileage goal for the week. What do you tell those athletes that have a hard time switching paradigms between like miles a week run versus elevation gain per week run?
Well, first of all, you're going to be slow. It's just a slower way of running, right? If you have to set someone's expectation that you're going to be slower in these kinds of races. Every climb is going to be slower than you can descend, right? So your average minutes per mile is going to be lower. So you can't think of it as, you know, your miles per week being lower. Think of it as your effort is staying the same. So you're putting in a lot of effort to get that gain, and you also got to put in the recovery effort for that.
Yeah, I think it's super prevalent too. And like, so I've been going to the gym a lot because I've been doing some spin, and I was incorporating some treadmill hiking at like an incline percentage. And for anybody that's out there, when you're going up a hill, you are spending a significant more amount of energy to go slower. And one way that you can see this and you can measure this is if you you get on a treadmill, you plug in your weight, it'll give you a general MET number. And what that MET is a metabolic equivalency threshold. So let's say you're running flat at 6 miles an hour and you have a score of 11 METs. That means you're working at 11 times your basal metabolic rate. If you start to hit that incline button, you'll see that MET number skyrocket. Now all of a sudden you're going at a 10% grade at 3 miles an hour, but your METs are like 15. So you are spending you're spending 15 times your basal metabolic rate as opposed to 11 times your basal metabolic rate, going slower, but also moving uphill. So I think that mindset shift, even though I know this, right? Like even to myself is just kind of hard to get around like, oh yeah, like you're gonna be moving slower if you're focused on vert, you know?
Yeah, and just switch the numbers, right? So some people somewhere they say that you should probably try to get like, you know, when you try to do your volume for an ultra, like say you're training for like a 50 miler, you want to kind of have like that 40, 50 mile week with the long runs at the end to kind of like supplement and help your body adapt to the situation. For these mountain races, switch the mindset to getting in that gain instead of the mileage, and you realize that it's a lot harder than you think it is.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. You know, a lot of the athletes we coach do happen to be in the Midwest and do not have a lot of climb. I have somebody, you know, that we wasn't even going for a mountain race, but a race that was going to have some hills in it. And the only hill she had was an overpass, you know, so she was practicing on this only one overpass in her area. So I think, you know, when we're thinking about flatlanders and going to the mountains to run, and maybe they don't have hills, what do you think about using the treadmill and how do you incorporate that?
Absolutely. I have done that myself, right? I do have the opportunity to go back and test myself. My mom still lives in the area, so I'll just stay with her and I'll like go out and adventure. There's plenty of races and ultras and trails and everything. It's just kind of a joy to be there. But most of the time I'm stuck here, and most of the time it's winter, right? So you're not even going to get very good traction during the winter with snow, even if you do have a hill, right? So
Right.
you need to consider like, how can I adapt my training to do this? Like, this is now very overwhelming. So if you do have access to that treadmill with the incline, then that is going to help you tremendously. And I have done it when I did Hellgate 100K, which has a very hard cutoff. I spent about a month and a half just doing that elevation gain. Like my number of miles was maybe like 2 or 3 miles a day. Like my mileage was very low, but the time that I was taking was more than like an hour and a half, like doing this work. I was just doing a lot of work, a lot of climbing. And every day I would set like a new goal. I would have a day where I would hike, you know, a little bit faster, but I would be at a 10% grade. And some days I would try to hike like a higher percentage, like 15 to 18% at just the same effort, but it's going to be so much slower. And I would kind of switch off on those and try to add up the elevation gain. And at some point, I made it just a fun goal for myself to get the elevation mile. So you do a mile, just a vertical mile, and you can do it at any pace you want. It's actually really challenging. So sometimes you're tempted to just kind of push the little incline button up so you're going a little bit faster, but then your pace is slower. So, you know, it's kind of like a little mind game that you can play with yourself, and it actually pays off really well. You can also do the stair stepper if you have access to like a gym or something like that. Kind of aiming for a certain number of steps per minute is kind of how you keep yourself accountable on the stair stepper. I would also highly encourage, if you know like your heart rate zones, to keep an eye on that, because you don't want to like overexert yourself, because the point of going into an event like a mountain race is to have your, you know, relative perceived effort at a very, very steady level. It doesn't matter if you're like on the West Coast or the East Coast, that climbing is pretty consistent. Like sometimes you get a little, you know, reprieve here and there, but if you can keep your effort at the same level and not go beyond a certain point where you're actually putting in too much work, then you're going to be able to climb very efficiently, and you're going to be able to have more for later in the race. So another thing that you can do at home that I encourage everybody to do, even, you know, mountain races or not, is kind of work on agility during the winter. You can buy one of these like little balls that have like little knobs on them, and you can like bounce it and you can try to catch it. That kind of helps those tiny little muscles work, so that when you're not on trails, you're still kind of keeping some of those trail muscles, because we all have trail muscles. Like if you've taken time off the trail for a while and then you go back and do the trail and your ankles are a little sore, but you're not injured, that's, you know, kind of doing some agility work and doing strength training will go a long ways to helping you get through the winter.
Okay, whoa. So back up. This little ball has like little nubs on it. I've never heard of one of these, but my mind blown. Is this what you're describing? Is so it's this ball that when you throw it, you have no idea the trajectory it's going to take, but you have to react and laterally cut or come forwards or backwards in order to make that. That's a fantastic tool. Why have I never seen one of these things? That's
It's like
something that be up
$5 to
my
$7.
oh,
It's pretty cheap.
okay, can we take a pause and can I go on to Amazon.com and buy one right now? Because that's fantastic.
Yeah, and if one bounce isn't challenging enough, you can bounce it twice. Let it
Mhm.
bounce twice, and then it's like it's really crazy.
I love
Oh,
it. So next week on the podcast, Reese, I want you to, oh wait, we're taking a pause next week, but after Christmas, hopefully Santa brings you one, and I want to see this live.
I don't have a Christmas list, but that's now number one. Wow. Okay, thanks. So you're talking about this vertical mile. Are you talking about where you do whatever you need to do, whatever incline, whatever speed, but you're trying to go for what is it, 5,280 feet of climb or something like that? Is that a
Yeah,
mile?
yeah, you get the number of feet. I could look it up on Google really quick if you want. But
No,
I think the minimum it's taking me to do that might be about 4 miles.
mhm.
You know, because even if you do it once, you can do it again and see if you can lower the amount of distance.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And like I've personally been in my head, and this is for like me and my athletes and for everybody listening, this is kind of what goes on in our coaching brains right now is I want to come up with my own personal test that like I give to athletes to see, hey, what are your climbing legs like? What is your tempo like after a certain amount of climbing that you've had, just to kind of get a gauge on like how can we standardize how well you're doing with a lot of climbing, but then also running after a lot of climbing. And I think doing something like that vertical mile test is just a great benchmark to say, hey, if you keep your heart rate between X heart rate, like at X percentage, like how long is it going to take you to get up that? And maybe that's a good metric that people can use to proxy their progress instead of just saying like, I'm building up to X mileage per week. And for everybody listening too, I think like what you just described in the past 5 minutes are like all of these complex calculations that go on in your head, other than how far is my running athlete per week, or is my athlete running per week? How fast is my athlete running per week? Because we know that like things like raw volume, like raw mileage and raw speed don't always translate when you have a mountain in front of you. So I think that's absolutely beautiful. If listeners want to go back and review this, the last 5 minutes are key. So, okay, so we talked about like elevation. I guess my last question would be, um, say somebody doesn't want to go on the treadmill, or somebody's like, I'm just kind of a solo runner. I do it to be outside. I'll do hill repeats, but I'm not going to do a long sustained climb on the treadmill. Um, how do you view that? I've personally had some athletes that are like, I will if I have to, but like I don't really like it. And then if people don't like it, I don't want to program it for them. But can short repeats of like 50 to 100 feet, which is pretty generous for this area in Illinois that we are, um, can people train their legs for mountain races based on just 50 to 100-foot hill repeats?
There's still a little bit more you can add. They still may not like it, but if they're determined to kind of do something like that, you can add, like a weighted vest. But that has to be added in pretty slowly so that your body can adapt to it, because you are adding weight. Just because like you can't just jump into like a 15-pound vest or, higher than that. You might want to start out with like, okay, do a minute with a weighted vest, like on flat ground. Like you want to build it up, like you kind of switch like the drops in shoes. Like if you're going from like a 12 millimeter drop in shoes to like 4, you don't want to do that in like 2 weeks. You want to do that over like 4 to 6 weeks so that people don't hurt their Achilles or things like that. So it's kind of the same thing with the weighted vest. Your bones still need to adapt to the stress. And once you build up to that point, then you can start doing the hill repeats. And then you can also add in like short little stints of like harder effort, right? So you still kind of want to get that heart rate up. You don't want to like let it kind of go by the wayside, like, oh yeah, I'm in zone 2 climbing this, 100-foot hill or whatever, even with the vest on. You still want to get some sort of fitness from that, even if the hill is very short. So, and then you can also say, you can do the mountain climbers, like the strength workout. You can do some of that cardio. I would also probably emphasize doing something like Bulgarian split squats, and you can add weights to those. You can start with 0 weight if you wanted to do that, just to get the form down. But building up, the quads and the calves, doing calf raises and all of that will still get you going and get you progress.
Okay. So as an adjunct, if somebody's not willing to hit those long sustained climbs, those would all be good proximals.
Yes, but I will say it will make it so much easier if you can, get in the climbs. It's like people who don't like speed work, just if you just try it out, reformat it so that it's a little bit more fun. I try to like, format to something that someone will be willing to do, right? Even if it's just an adaptation of it.
I like that analysis between like speed work and hill training. And a lot of people I find if they're turned off from speed work, right? Maybe they're doing all of their speed work wrong. Like say if somebody is terrified of like K repeats, well, are you doing those K repeats at like your max effort? Of course, I would be terrified of that. That's like any max effort for anything, but sometimes that's all that people think about when they think about repeats or speed work is just max efforting everything. Whereas maybe we do K repeats, but we do it at like your 10K or half marathon pace, which in that case, then it's really sustainable. So, and that's speed work for like these ultra marathons. And I feel like with hill training too, if somebody's RPE is kind of off, right? Like if they're going out and they're hiking and they're giving a 10 out of 10 for the hike, just like you said before, like it's not as advantageous as if you kind of teach your body, hey, like, how do I get into this rhythm and click along? So I love that you brought that parallel between the two.
Yeah, and I mean, you could still include speed work in all of this as well, because what speed work does, especially short, fast intervals, is gives you that explosive power that you might need if, say, you like trip on a rock going uphill or downhill, and you can catch yourself a lot better. So just having that kind of like muscle reactivity.
Yeah, absolutely. And two, that ball drill that we were talking about before, that will build that reactivity of like, oh shoot, I got to move my body like really quick right now. What do I do? You know?
Yeah. Because I mean, it's not that I just have experience with like the East Coast, but also like the West Coast where there's more scree, right? So, especially in places like, the Rocky Mountains, especially in the southern part, there's a lot of loose rock and you can literally just slip on anything. And if you can catch yourself, to save yourself a lot of grief, of course, because usually it's downhill and you're going to fall backwards on your butt. So, just kind of having like the strength to kind of catch yourself is just kind of like a really big part of the game as well.
Yeah.
Nice. What are your thoughts on trekking poles?
Trekking poles, I think it's up to the person. This past weekend, I didn't use them. There still was some pretty good climbing, but I've used them and I've not used them. I prefer in longer races to have them than not, but absolutely, if you have not used them, they're not as efficient if you like haven't practiced with them. So I would definitely encourage if you are going to use trekking poles to find some that are the correct height. Tall poles are not going to do short people much good if you're holding them down here, because what you're supposed to do is, they have the straps, right? So you slip your hand through the strap and then you're supposed to like let your forearm rest on the strap so that, it's not your hand that's taking it, but your forearm so that you can put actual weight on the pole to help yourself up. I also like using them downhill in case your quads get tired, and then you're more likely to have good form and you're more likely to be upright. So there's a lot of advantages to using poles. And I know there are races, especially mountain races, that say, nah, you can't use poles. And, I think one of them is Western States, I believe. So, if you're going to not use poles, don't use poles in practice. So, make sure that your climbing is good without them. So when you're using the treadmill, do not put your hands on the sidebars.
Good tips. Good tips. What about training for a race that's going to be at a higher elevation than you live? What are your thoughts on getting adapted for that? And then also like at what point do you go to a race?
So I read a lot of research on it, and people say there's the hot debate on whether you should go there a week early or 2 weeks early or just right away, like the night before. And the research really is if you kind of have to live there for like a month for your body to replenish the type of red blood cell that is more efficient at that altitude. So, don't I would not say stress yourself about getting there super early. I really don't think that like a week is going to help too much based off of the research. So what I tell people is just throw pace out the window, especially if you don't know how your body is going to react, and to stay very, very, very hydrated the higher up you go, because you do not realize, especially in these dry climates, how much water you're actually losing because it's evaporating off your skin before you realize that you're actually sweating. But the rule of thumb is the perceived effort. So, some people go out there and they'll just, hammer the trails and their heart rate sink in zone 4. And they're like, I don't know why I'm so tired. It's just the elevation. But actually, if you slow down just a little bit and reach that effort that you're used to, you will be pretty successful.
I want to bring an example. Oh, what were you gonna say, Coach?
Nope, I'm good.
A personal example, I went out to race the Wasatch Front 100 last year. Had never been to altitude. Of course, as coaches, we know like rate of perceived exertion is king. But if an athlete can go out and experience their body, especially if they've never been to altitude, whether it's just go like for a day or 2 days, go out for a short run, because everybody has a different feeling when they're at altitude. I've talked with other people, and my experience is my lungs don't do a lot of work when I'm at altitude, but my heart will be pumping. So if I'm running like, like on like anywhere else in the country except altitude, anywhere that's 6,000 foot or below, or like, what I listen to is my breathing mainly is how hard am I breathing? Because it's kind of harder to feel your heartbeat as opposed to like feel your ventilation. So when I was out running Wasatch, I was like, oh yeah, like I'm breathing pretty good. Like I feel all right. And then I get to the top of a climb, like I go to refill some water bottles. I'm at an aid station, and all of a sudden it's like now I feel my heart is beating out of my chest, and I'm like, oh shoot, I think I've been going too hard. and a lot of times by that time it's a little bit too late. So even like your rate of perceived effort is going to slightly change. So if you don't have the opportunity to go out before a race, like you want to be paying attention to a lot of those things. And that's where they say go a lot easier than you think you need to, because of course it's way easier to overshoot than to undershoot how hard you are actually working at altitude.
Yeah, and there's no fault that if you're on some sort of like sustained climb, like, 1+ miles of climbing, if you need to stop and let things settle, like you just need a little bit of, you know, then do it because it will save you.
So what is your like strategy, or how do you talk with athletes about like, okay, we have the altitude, we have the elevation. How are we working the uphills? How are we working the downhills?
The downhills are a little bit more tricky. That's typically where I like to include more strength because we just don't have the long downhills. There's just nowhere. I don't, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. We just don't have those sustained hills. And you really need that loading factor for your legs to, really kind of get the stress to recover to your body needs to learn. So that's where I've done fancy little things with people. Like if you have a flat run that you're going to go do, I'll have them run for 4 minutes and then for 1 minute do walking lunges. So then you have to run for another 4 minutes at a certain effort. So then you have to run on the fatigue. So I feel like that does help a lot of us here, especially if, you're going out the door for, one of your normal runs, whether it's on the road or trail. Just being able to do something from your door makes things that much easier for an athlete. And then what was the second part of that?
Oh, how do we attack the uphills versus how do we attack the downhills? Like we talked a lot about uphills, but like what are we thinking about when we're going downhill? Are we trying to, work on is that where we make up time? Is that where we save the quads? Like how does that strategy kind of play in?
So, it depends on the distance as well. If you're doing something like a half marathon, you should be okay to try to push the downhills a little bit. But if you're thinking about like the ultra distance and then you have these long downhills, like 1+ miles, then you really need to hold back, but not like physically hold yourself backwards. So one thing I like to tell people, which a lot of people don't tend to know, is your technique in running downhill is, and this is a little bit hard for people to understand, but say you have like a downhill grade, a lot of people lean backwards and there's a lot of braking motion, right? And that's going to put a lot more strain on every part of your body. So what you want to do is kind of lean forward into the hill and be able to run down instead of backwards. Don't lean back. So you want to let gravity do some of the work for you. So think about it as kind of like free energy. And so that's where some of the strength comes in, and that where you need to develop like a better core to kind of like hold yourself in that position. So as long as like your upper body, and then of course that starts to fail, later on in the race, and that's when you can bring the poles in to try to like do that work for you. But that at that point, it's more of just like realizing that your legs are going to be hurting, especially in, the latter half of the race, and that as long as your legs are not buckling, you can still run and you can still do a decent pace downhill. It's just that the training leading up to it to make sure that that doesn't feel as bad.
That's fantastic. And I really want to recap the last couple minutes again, because what you said was beautiful and I haven't heard a lot of other coaches mention this, but it's a Steve Magnus principle. So like if anybody wants to go look at his books, he's just a phenomenal author and coach. But this idea of adding speed work and quote unquote stuff. So like what you said before was doing your run, doing some walking lunges, and then doing your run afterwards. And it's in that stuff or the walking lunges where we can then try to add more specific fatigue for an athlete. So maybe like a great workout for somebody who's preparing for like a mountainous race, but they only have time to run out their front door on one day. Maybe we do like a tempo, a 20-minute tempo to kind of warm up the system, warm up the aerobic system, generate a little bit of fatigue. Then maybe we do some air squats, or maybe we do a couple. Maybe we do some walking lunges and start to load those hips, more flexion and extension, load those knee angles a little bit more than what you would get just in your typical run. So that way, when you go and you finish maybe a latter part of your tempo, or you go to do some like hill repeats or something like that, we have a little bit more fatigue than is just flat running fatigue. Now we've stressed the joints in a range with which they're probably going to experience on race day. So it's those workouts and stuff added in the middle that a lot of athletes don't think about, because us runners, we just want to go run for the hour that's prescribed. So we have our strength training bucket, we have our running bucket, but what you just described was within our running bucket, we can do some body weight like stuff in order to generate specific fatigue, which I think a lot of runners have a hard time doing because, right, we get out the door, we're running, we don't want to stop to do walking lunges, we don't want to stop to do air squats. But
people are talking about pace so often
Yeah.
about it. And that's what it goes back to the beginning, is that you've got to throw pace out the window. And I think this is one really useful way to kind of like forget about it. Yeah, you're probably going to end up with like a 14-minute mile if you're stopping and doing air squats, right? But like, it's that kind of like mindset that like, yes, this workout is going to work me and this is going to help me.
It's instead of thinking about what is my average Strava time going to be like on the workout summary, it's thinking about how is this workout, regardless of what the average pace is, or regardless if I'm running or doing lunges, how is this workout going to give me the adaptations that I need to be successful on race day? And that's not always going out for just like 2 miles on flat road, like easy or whatever, especially if we're throwing in altitude, mountains. So again, I sorry to belabor the point, but you're throwing out like a lot of good things here that I don't hear from a lot of other coaches pertaining to these mountain runs. So that's absolutely beautiful, and I'm thrilled that you said all that.
Yeah, it's actually a lot more work to live in the Midwest and train for one of these races than if you actually have access to, going somewhere with a large hill every weekend. We just don't have that. So
And that's what can make it more fun too, right? If we kind of like reconceptualize what does it mean to be a mountain athlete, or what does it mean to be an ultra runner, instead of thinking like I'm a runner, or I'm trying to take my road marathon principles to like something with elevation and altitude. Instead of thinking about that, thinking about like mileage, like thinking about like how is this workout going to prepare me for the race of my dreams, like we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. So a lot of times, like us trail runners, we got to be 3D athletes.
yeah, I mean, I totally believe that running is not kind of like a solo sport, right? You've got to support running with other things. You can get away with a lot more if you're doing flat running, like or rail trails or something like that, but you're still going to have some of those niggles. And it's like, it's acceptable, if you get done with something like, tunnel and you're like, oh, I'm a little like sore from like my core is holding me up, and you get those little things. And like for me, when I do mountain races, sometimes my forearms get really sore even if I'm not using poles, because I'm pulling myself up with my forearms. It's a really, really weird feeling. Some people get like upper body soreness from doing these races at like not really using it. So that's where the strength kind of comes in, is that you can always lessen what you experience on race day and be more efficient if you do these things leading up to it.
Yeah, that's right. And I do love that you mentioned too, like building out your speed, building out your elevation, building out this like profile of a well-rounded athlete. Because when we're running marathons, like a lot of work is sure faster than marathon pace, slower than marathon pace. But if you're just running like flat roads, you're not switching back and forth between gears even. And when we're running these ultras, right, like we have flat sections of race, we have rolling hill sections of race, we have where you're just going to be hiking. So we got to touch on all of these gears instead of just thinking how much overall mileage am I getting per week.
Yeah, and that's how we end up with like the kind of terrible stereotype of tight hip flexors and runners. We don't do a lot of stretching, a lot of yoga. That takes a lot of time and patience out of our schedule, right? And some people don't do their foam rolling. I tell you, do your foam rolling this week. So we try to ignore the things that are easy to overlook, right? We all do it. I do it. I'm just like, I don't need to foam roll tonight. I don't need this kind of recovery. I'll just take a protein shake or something like that, make excuses. But if you really want to be the best you, then we do need to incorporate this, 3D athlete.
That is
Love that.
beautiful.
So Steph, for somebody that's maybe thinking about their first mountain ultra, do you have any recommendations of good races that would be a good place to start?
So I suggest kind of like looking at what calls to you. Like if you look at race pictures or pictures of the area and you find a trail that's just like, wow. So for me, Hellbender was on my bucket list for a while. And this past year, I actually went up to the summit just by car. And being up there, and I mean, we didn't do anything. We maybe hiked like a small mile at the summit, and there's just all of these spruce trees up there, and it smells like Christmas. The whole place just smells like pine, and it's not pine salt. It's like actually like the Christmas candle sort of scent. And it's just this magical thing. And you want to be like passionate about like what you pick. Like some people that might be Leadville, like you want to go, past like Twin Lakes, and Hope Pass is like, yes, if I can do Hope Pass, I feel like really good about myself. Maybe that's something that speaks to you. Maybe it's like the Pacific Northwest and like the Cascades, where it's like, yes, I want to run through a tropical rainforest, but I don't want it to be too hot. There's a lot of things that go into like picking a race, and it's the same thing as we do when we pick a race for ourselves in like the Midwest. Like maybe we want to pick something like Hennepin's 50K, and we want to like just smash it like through the night. That's our own goal. It's like, yes, I can trust this course. I know what I want to do. So it's kind of like finding something. And it's usually like, if you look at, I would encourage people to look at the cutoffs. Like usually mountain races have longer cutoffs, and especially like the lower distances, if you just kind of wanted a taste for that and do like a 50K and really see, like, look at that elevation and the profile. So that's really, really important in these kinds of races, because Superior actually has a lot of elevation gain, but it's all just like sawtooth climbs, right? It's a lot of gain, but it's all sawtooth. So it's not like sustained stuff, but it's just over, over, and over again. So it's a different type of stimulus versus like if you look at something like I did Cloud Splitter 100, it has 3 major climbs, and those climbs are 2 to 3 miles long. So you just look at the profile, it's just like boop, 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 and then some ridge line, and then there's a final climb, and then a 10-mile descent at the end. That's going to be very different training than if you were doing something like Superior, which has it has less gain, but it's pretty similar, but it's just formatted in a different way. So if you look at like a 50K profile and there's just one little climb and it's got 7,000 feet of climbing, that's significant. And it's going to be pretty slow going if you're going uphill for like 9 miles, even if it's like, at an 8% grade, it's pretty constant. So it's something that you can do is just kind of go sample and then see if you want to do something longer. That'll give you an idea of like the trails and the texture of the trails, and kind of like, what do I need to do to approach this? And, we can always help as coaches as well, especially with our experience. So, there's just beauty everywhere. So I encourage people to look everywhere, and there's Vermont and everything like that. And, there's stuff in Arkansas. There's like I think the Arkansas Traveler and the Pinhoti and things like that. And they also have pretty decent climbs. And then there's like Arizona with, there are mountains out there, and it's very dry, but it's not as high, So there's all just kind of like taste of everything.
Hey, I love that. And that's exactly what I think about when I talk to athletes when they're picking something. Pick something that you love, that calls you, especially if you're doing a really long ultra, like 100. You want to really want to be out there to enjoy it. And if you're like really excited about it, I think it makes the day go a lot better.
It does. And, you got to think about that when you do an event, and this is with any event, that there's always going to be some sort of weather. Weather always exists. So if you love an event, then you can really embrace whatever weather it is thrown at you, which I know a lot of people get discouraged. It's like, oh, it's raining. I'm like, I don't really feel like doing this, but you trained for so long for this. So what happened in that, maybe this wasn't like exactly the best event or something, if that's how you feel, but you want to go somewhere where it's like, oh, it's raining. It's going to be a little bit tricky, but man, it's going to make for a really great story. You kind of want to the way that you think about it.
This is such a fantastic topic, and I do want to kind of wrap in psychology as a whole. So I'm looking at your Cloud Splitter time right now, and I actually just went online and looked up the course profile, and it is a gnarly course profile. And one thing that I like about races is you find that one that you really love, you want to do really well at it. If you look at the course profile in elevation, some of them will actually give you the percentage of climbs that you're going to hit, so you can kind of replicate that in training, right? But back to psychology. My first question, I got two main questions for you. The first one is so you finished Cloud Splitter in 39 hours. How do you get through 39 hours of endurance, and how do you psychologically prepare yourself and then execute that type of race? And once we go through that, I want to ask you my second question.
So that race has a 40-hour cutoff. A lot happened. It was my very first 100 that I finished.
Wow. Congratulations.
I DNF'd my first at 100K due to like all sorts of blister issues, a course that was not known to me. I found out about the course kind of like a week before. Someone told me that it was mostly sand, and I had not trained for that the entire time. And I asked like the race director, I was like, well, what's the course like? And they're just soft footing. I'm like, well, it was very frustrating. So it was very frustrating. So I switched gears and I did something that I was stronger at. I was like, if I choose an East Coast 100 with like a longer cutoff, I know what the trails, I know what to expect. And so I had a lot of confidence going into that. 40 hours is a long time to be on the trails. So then you get into like, well, I don't know what's going to happen overnight. I've never stayed up that long. And then I have to go into a second night. Like, oh my goodness. I didn't expect to be out there that long. A lot happened. It was a race where, and it's mid-October, it always rains. So of course it rained, but it was a time when a cold front encountered a hurricane and it stalled out over the race. So there was a lot of wind and it was very cold. And it was just nothing I was good at weather-wise. And I had torn my anterior tibialis at mile 15. And I didn't know that because I'd never experienced that. I just assumed, well, this is what 100s feel like. It's supposed to be painful. And so, by mile 74, I'm just like crying. I was like, I can't run downhill because like your anterior tibialis is like on the front part of your foot where like the inside of it. And it helps you go downhill. So I had this amazing pacer who was there for me. And like having an amazing pacer really can help your mentality and having the right person there. And she was very good at climbing. And she was like, if we want to beat the cutoff, we've got to run uphill. And that fights every single ultra instinct that you have. Is running uphill in a mountain race was just um nightmarish. But I was determined to finish. It was my first time and I was like, this is what I came here for. I'm going to finish this. They will have to pull me off this course, which they pulled an aid station off the course because the course got flooded. So they had to rescue an aid station. So I was actually missing the aid station at mile 85. And so it was a wild ride.
When you were preparing for this race, what were you visualizing? Like, were you visualizing like perfect conditions, or were you visualizing rainy conditions? I'm kind of trying to lead this into like one thing that I've tried to adopt over the past couple months is I always visualize perfect conditions in my races. And then when the forecast shows a non-perfect condition, it's like,
Oh
oh my,
man.
that's everything I ever thought about. You know what I mean?
So I don't really think about like the rain or the sun or anything like that. I think about temperature a lot. So it's just like, well, I'm gonna buy a lot of gear because when I taper, I buy a lot of stuff. That is my really bad habit is I buy a lot of stuff and a lot of stuff I don't need. So I'm like, ooh, it might be cold. So I'm gonna go look and research like these rain jackets. And so then I end up having like all this gear. So I had like all the gear that you could possibly want for this race. So that's how I kind of handled that. But I think about the trail. I think about what's going to happen. But part of me personally, on a mental thing, is I really like seeing a course for the first time. I don't like seeing a course beforehand. I like everything to be new. I want to, see it as an adventure that like every step I take is somewhere that I haven't been.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I really like doing, these long like adventure courses like that is like what can I do? And then, of course, because of the race went the way it did, I went back the next year and I did a lot better. And it was very, very different conditions. It was a drought. So all of the creek beds, there's probably like 90 plus creek crossings in that race. Instead of being wet, I was dry the whole time. And ironically, because the creek beds were dry, all of the moss was very, very, very slick. So it was actually worse. So it's just really interesting thinking about what trail is going to give you on that day. You just never know. You don't know exactly what the climate has been in that area if you don't live there. So you're kind of just thinking like, how can I prepare like me and my drop bags to the best of my ability to compensate for what might happen?
Mhm. That's fantastic. I love it. Uh,
Yes.
okay, so okay, that was a tangent. My actual second question is so personally I've never run through the night, and I want to use this time as some selfish time for me to personally ask you, like, what is your like what is your mindset going into the evening? How did you prepare for your first nighttime like adventure? Or did you, or was it something that you just found yourself in during a race? Or what do you instruct your other athletes to do? It's a loaded question. I'm sorry, I know.
Yeah, actually, I don't get a lot of questions about the nighttime running. A lot of people just accept it. I've not had anybody really complain about it. They if you're doing 100, you kind of expect to run through the night unless you miss Reese. Um, but it was a few times that I'd ran a little bit in the evenings when it was dark outside, so it's not super new. You kind of need the expectation that it will be a little slower, because when you have a headlamp on, you see the ground and everything is passing by you so quickly, and then you look at your watch and it's 3 minutes per mile slower than what you were running in the day. And you don't feel any different. So it's just kind of like the perception of, wow, the trees are going by so fast. The rocks they just keep coming. Like it's definitely like a little bit of a changed perception, which you can get over with practice. Just kind of like knowing that your kind of like self-awareness, and I think your foot turnover is a huge part of that, not letting your cadence drop at night, because you tend to be a little bit more careful, you tend to be stepping a little bit shorter, and that's kind of all the result of it being dark. Now the way I mentally handle it is, and this just happened, like I didn't teach myself this, but there's something magical about being on the trails at night. I know a lot of people will say this, is that when it's about 2 or 3 a.m., you might be feeling a little tired. Um, Turn off your headlamp if it's clear out, and then just like look at the stars and just kind of like realize what you have around you. And it's actually just something very, very magical, and it's very quiet. It's very quiet unless the cicadas are out in the middle of summer. But, running through the night, getting towards that, 5 a.m. mark where the sun starts to rise. And then you really kind of start looking around, looking for the sun, waiting for it, and like kind of putting yourself in a mental perspective that, yes, the sun is rising, a new day is here. And there's kind of like a refreshment about that. And you can, I think, discover a lot about yourself. Um, but yeah, that's kind of like how it happened. I'm also a night person, so it kind of helps. I actually probably paced more people at night before I ran in the dark myself.
Mhm.
So that's kind of like a really good way to kind of experience it and then like help someone out at the same time, is like say, yeah, I'll take the mile, 80 through 90 or something like that with someone. And it's quite an experience. But also on that note, it's a little tiny tangent for you about caffeine. If caffeine works for you, it does not work for me. I'm ADHD. It makes me very sleepy. But for people who do use caffeine, do not use it early in the race. Try not to have that cup of coffee in the morning, because your body can only process so much caffeine to give you energy. So you'll want to use that later in the race when you actually feel tired. So probably like, after that 1 a.m. mark, then start kind of like dabbling in that caffeine to try to give you that little boost. And I know people have used like caffeine gum pretty successfully. But it depends on like, if you want to chew that that late in a race. Some people like me do not like chewing, so we'll have like a little drink or something like that. But just dabbling in caffeine and on the later side will help a lot of people, and not using it up too early.
Oh, wonderful. More nuggets, more golden nuggets, everyone.
So I think that pretty much wraps it up for today. Is there anything more that you would like to share, Steph, that we might have missed?
Oh yeah. So one note that I want to tell people about are like safety kits.
Okay.
So a lot of races in the mountains sometimes require that you carry some amount of safety. So if you're looking at doing a mountain race, make sure you really, really read the webpage to make sure that you know what the required gear is, especially if you're running in the Rockies where it will get pretty cold at night, even in the middle of the summer, because the West, the temperatures are not like here or the East Coast. The East Coast might drop like 7 degrees, and maybe on the mountain an additional 3 to 4 degrees at night, just because like the humidity and everything kind of keeps things pretty regulated. But there's nothing like that in the West. The atmosphere, and you're higher up, the temperature is just going to drop like 20 to 25 degrees, and then on the mountain it might drop another 10 degrees. So they typically will have you carry some sort of like emergency blanket, like a Mylar blanket, which you can get by just running a cold marathon sometimes. And I don't know, I stash all this stuff in like a bag so that I have it, so they don't have to buy it. So this is a little cheap way, pay for a marathon Mylar blanket. But it's more of like, try to find like a stashable puffy coat, like how they can break down into like little bags. Those are probably the most valuable thing that you can carry with you. Even if you're not expecting the temperature to drop, the weather on mountain summits is very, very different from what you will read from like the Weather Channel on like the base of the mountain. It can be very, very different. The clouds are up there and everything, and so like the climate can be completely different. You also typically need to have like a safety whistle, which most packs come with now, which is really good. So like check for like a tiny little plastic piece on your pack, see if you got one of those. And then some people will say that, okay, you need to carry like a water filtration device. There's some really like simple ones that you can carry with you. And that's kind of like if it's a really hot race, and you kind of get stuck between aid stations and you got in trouble, you didn't fill your water up as much, or you just kind of ran out. That's something useful to have. And then my personal favorite that I learned in my very first 100K, which I was expecting to be 80 degrees. And I did not pack for 40 degrees, and it ended up snowing. It was another great first experience, and some guy saved me by giving me his beanie and covering my head, and having that extra warmth really saved my race. I was only 13 miles in, and I'd done all the training. I trained with a 50K and everything for this 100K. And you carry just a little beanie. This stuff does not take up a lot of space. So just kind of like being prepared for anything would really help, and probably keep you a lot more comfortable.
Right. Those are really good tips. And I feel like some of the bigger races, even like Bigfoot and Tahoe, they have a pretty big requirement of things that you carry. So do you also practice with some of that on your training runs, practicing carrying
Yeah.
that weight?
Bigfoot's in the 200s. Some of the mountain 200s are very, very extensive lists. They'll include like GPS trackers that you're required to carry and check in and everything like that, plus a bunch of additional items. There's a minimum water requirement that you have to carry, for instance. There's just a lot more rules. So for me, I do recommend that even if you're on a treadmill, to put on your pack fully weighted. And even if you're just doing like a power hike session, like I encourage people, even if you're doing regular running, have like a regular power hike session where you just kind of challenge yourself to go at a certain pace or effort, just once a week, just to keep your slowest pace faster is what I say. You're only as fast as your slowest pace. So, weigh up that vest. And I used to do this for a race that I was working on, where you would have to carry a railroad spike, and that's a few pounds in itself. And so you're going to be carrying something. You're probably going to be carrying like 1.5 liters of water or something, and that's not nothing. If anyone's ever tried on like a hydration pack, they always try it on in the store, but like you really need to try it on with like your bottles and your bladder, whatever you're going to carry, to see how the hydration pack fits that way. So that's like a useful little tip for that. But I do encourage, like, and that's where, like, you could just use a weighted vest if you had one, or if you wanted to train with one and invest in that, that's a little bit easier. But there's a little bit more work involved with that versus just putting on your pack from the kitchen. So
Wow, wow, what a bunch of great tips for training for the mountains. So I just want to also say that Coach Steph is accepting athletes right now. So if you're interested in coaching with Steph, you can reach out to me at loretta.ornerymulracing@gmail.com, and I can get you hooked up with her and get you started. It's a great time to start thinking about that with races coming up soon for 2024. Anything last, Reese?
No, thank you so much for coming on with us. It was super fun. Thank you for all your expertise and your diverse skill set and knowledge that you just willfully shared with all of us today. So we greatly appreciate it. And it's been a very, very fantastic hour. So thank you so much.
no problem.
Yeah, and I also want to say, check out our social media. We started 12 days of coaching tips today, which was kicked off with Coach Lindsay. So there's going to be a lot of great information for the next 12 days talking about coaching. And also there's some great reels with Steph in the mountains and talking a little bit about some hill training and running on trails will be coming up. So lots of little nuggets of information out there for you. We do have a couple new coaching programs that are kicking off in January. Myself and Dr. Lisa Elsie, our physical therapist, is putting together a ladies training group. So it's ladies only, and she specializes in pelvic health and running. So that will be our focuses along with strength and training plans. So that's one thing. And we're also developing a team coaching approach. So if you have questions, reach out to me and I would love to share about the services that we have. So it was great seeing both of you. Thanks a lot for coming on, Steph. And I even learned some great tips to add to my coaching toolbox. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye, everyone.